So earlier this week, I was having a conversation with an architect friend, and one of the topics that I've been thinking a lot about recently came up, and it's this idea of how can we make sure to have the most options for affordable housing in our communities. And I think one of the driving factors is development without land transaction. And in this video, I'd like to tell you what I think about that idea and what I think it means for development patterns in our communities. So when a developer buys a piece of land and figures out their construction costs and figures out their financing costs and all the other costs that go into a project, if they can't get an adequate return on those investment costs, the project isn't going to move forward. So, as in my other video where we discussed if you can't get the rent, you can't build the building, that's exactly what that factor is. If the income off of an investment isn't high enough, the investment doesn't go forward. And one of the major costs in a development is the land cost. And so, as we're looking forward to ways to solve the housing crisis, we talk a lot, especially in Raleigh and other communities around North Carolina, about missing middle housing, and that's moving forward. But one of the topics I don't hear discussed enough is how can we try to encourage development and intensification and densification of housing on properties where we don't need to see a land transaction? And the only way I can see that happening is if more of the community gets involved in the development process, right? So if you own a house and you build an accessory dwelling unit, an ADU in the backyard, you don't have to pay for the land. You've already bought the land. Whereas if a outside developer comes in, they're going to buy your house. So let's say I'm the developer. I'm going to buy your house and either intensify what's existing, so add additional housing around the current housing, or tear it down and build additional housing on the overall site. But either way, my cost basis for the land is factored in at that new higher market price, right? So if you bought the land 10 years ago with a house on it, or you bought the house 10 years ago, the land value and the home value has escalated since then. So any new investor, any new transaction is going to mean that the cost for that site is much higher than it is to you. The relative cost has increased greatly. So an existing homeowner can build an accessory dwelling unit and it's feasible at a much lower rent than a new homeowner who buys that land from them. If there's a transaction, the cost basis goes way up, and therefore the rent required to make that accessory dwelling unit feasible goes way up. So that just results in higher rents than otherwise would need be. Whereas if we can go into our existing communities with our existing landowners and help them build, or encourage them or incentivize them to build on their existing property, or educate them and teach them to build on their existing property, their land basis is effectively zero. So if you take the same, call it $200,000 ADU, just the structure, just the house part, and you build it on your own land, your cost basis, your all-in cost basis is between, call it two and $300,000, right? So the rent that you're going to be required to be paid back, if you're thinking from a market perspective, is based on that total $200,000 to $300,000 investment. If, on the other hand, somebody buys that home from you and builds the ADU, they're going to put a portion of that land cost, and let's say your home is valued at $600,000, they're going to put half of that total investment, or a third of that total investment, $200,000 or $300,000 of value, in as the land cost for that ADU. So now you're looking at the same ADU that costs between $200,000 and $300,000 to install, to build. You're putting that on top of a land cost of $300,000, which means the rent required to pay back that investment is going to have to be double what the current owner would have to charge to the market. Now, either way, they're going to be charging market rents. So in a market where the rent is really high, I don't see that bringing the market rent down, or the rent for that ADU down. But what that means is a lot of areas where the rent is lower, ADUs all of a sudden become feasible because we don't have to account for the adjustment in land value because of the transaction. So in summary, I think we need to figure out as communities how we make sure that some of this intensification and investment and densification in our communities is happening without land transactions. So with the existing owners being the developer. And I think that could have a huge impact on affordability in our communities. Let me know what you think in the comments below.